On the afternoon of July 9th, 1982, the tower at New Orleans International was occupied by 5 on-duty air traffic controllers. From their unique vantage point high over the airport environment, the Louisiana wetlands surrounding the city of New Orleans glistened under the afternoon sun, still high in the sky above. Temperatures and humidity were high, but none saw conditions as being anything other than normal for the time of year in the southern Gulf states of the US. In fact, studies showed that over the preceding 17 years, the average number of days in July where the airport was impacted by thunderstorms was just over 13.5. And so it was that as the afternoon approached, on cue, convective thunderstorms developed in the neighbourhood, isolated cells which commanded the attention and respect of both controllers and pilots alike, but which seldom caused any real significant concern. That said, however, complacency and thunderstorms make for a deadly potential mix, and so it was that some 60 minutes prior to the accident at 15:10 local, the Weather Service unit of the Houston, Texas Air Traffic Control Center, located some 350 miles to the west, had made a courtesy call to the tower in New Orleans to inform them that they had observed thunderstorms of level 4 and 5 category to the south and southwest of the airport in New Orleans. Their predicted tracks showed that the storm cells would move northwest towards the airport, and they had thus advised the controllers in New Orleans to keep a good eye on them. In post-accident depositions, the staff of Houston testified that their motivation for contacting New Orleans was simply to alert that facility to the possibility that these storms might affect arriving and departing traffic, and that pilot requests for deviation around such weather was more likely than not. Between them, the meteorologist in Houston and the controlling supervisor in New Orleans agreed that the nature of the call was more casual and informative than anything else, and as such no formal broadcast to pilots on the ATC frequencies in relation to the weather was deemed necessary, at least for the time being. By way of providing some background information, when the meteorologist in Houston referred to the observed thunder cells as Category 4 and 5, he was making reference to an established scale which classifies these types of storms according to their level of severity. The scale extends from a value of 1 at the lower end, by definition weak, all the way to 6, indicating the extreme end of the scale. At a value of 4 to 5, those caught in its path would expect to experience conditions of severe turbulence, lightning and strong wind gusts, with the possibility of hail mixed in for good measure. The observations of the meteorologists in Houston were indeed consistent with the content of the New Orleans area forecast, which had been issued earlier that morning at 7:40 local, and which related to a validity period stretching from 12 noon to 8 p.m. that evening. In short, the forecast warned of thunderstorms occasionally forming lines or clusters, with tops reaching to over 45,000 feet. A forecast, more specific to the immediate area of the airport, was released shortly thereafter, covering roughly the same time window, which made reference to the possibility of occasional reduced visibility as a result of thunderstorms and moderate rain showers. Although that said, there was no formal significant weather warnings in effect covering the time or geographic location where the accident occurred. In the midst of all this, on the ramp, Clipper 759 was preparing for departure on the second leg of 4, as it transited the lower US states from east coast to west. Having originated in Miami, Florida, intermediate en route stops at New Orleans and Las Vegas, Nevada, would finally see it arrive at its final destination of San Diego, California, later into the night. On the afternoon in question, Pan American Flight 759 was being serviced by a Boeing 727-200 series aircraft, noted on the US registry as November 4737. The aircraft itself started its working life in the colours of National Airlines, where it was delivered from the Boeing factory on January 3, 1968, making it almost 14 and a half years old. Following National's merger with PanAm 2.5 years earlier, November 4737 was incorporated into the Pan American fleet, and as is customary, was christened Clipper Defiance. Post-accident, the subsequent review of the aircraft's logs and maintenance records showed that all applicable airworthiness directives had been complied with, and that all checks and inspections has been completed within their specified time limits. In other words, November 4737 was, from a technical perspective, fit to fly. But it wasn't just the aircraft itself which had made the transition from national. Each of the 3 cockpit crew members that afternoon had likewise been incorporated into the Pan American family. Of the 3, the most senior and in command that day was one Captain Kenneth L. McCullers, age 45. McCullers was qualified as a 727 captain in late January 1972, some 10 and a half years before the accident, with just under 10,600 hours of his 11,700 hours total flight time being obtained in the cockpit of the 727 type. His first officer for the trip across the US was one Donald G. Pierce, aged 32. Having been flying the 727 for the previous 5 years, Pierce had accumulated over 3,900 hours on the type, out of a total time extending to just over 6,100. To the rear of the cockpit and operating the flight engineers panel was Second Officer Leo B. Noon, the oldest of the 3 at 60 years of age. In being the oldest on the flight deck, he was also the most experienced of the 3, with just under 20,000 hours under his belt, half of that being secured on the 727. This was an experienced crew who were familiar with the route, the weather environment of the southern US, and the system and handling characteristics of their aircraft. In addition to McCullers, Pierce and Noon, there was one other individual accommodated on the flight deck, referred to in the accident report as a non-revenue passenger, most likely a company staff member hitching a ride. In the cabin, the 3 cockpit crew were augmented by a further 4 cabin crew and 137 passengers, bringing the total souls on board to 145. As departure time approached, the crew of 759 picked up the latest ATIS broadcast, or Automatic Terminal Information Service, designated Information Foxtrot. The broadcast issued at 13:58 and reflecting the weather observation taken 3 minutes earlier, was now almost 2 hours old. It reported a scattered layer of cloud above the airport at 2,500 feet, 6 miles visibility and haze, with essentially calm winds and a warm surface temperature of 92 degrees Fahrenheit. The fact that Information Fox was more than 2 hours old was surprising, given the observed and anticipated convective activity in the area. A more up-to-date weather observation had been made at 14:55 local, almost an hour before 7:59 had pushed from the gate. Although the content of this new observation was almost identical to the last, it did, however, include a notable exception in that it had attached a plain language text making reference to cumulus build-ups overhead, east to south. According to facility procedures, the ground controller on duty is responsible for updating the ATIS messages. Subsequently, he admitted that his obvious failure to do so was a genuine unintentional oversight on his part. In what could be considered poor timing for the crew of 759, this oversight was corrected just after the aircraft pushed back from the gate. A routine observation made at 15:55 returned an observed visibility at odds with that being reported in the tower. As such, the tower supervisor requested a special observation to be made at 16:03, the results of which formed the basis of the revised information Gulf. In addition to the reduced visibility, which now showed as 2 miles in heavy rain shower, the surface wind had also picked up, indicating 14 to 20 knots out of the northeast. Of note, and of significant relevance to what will shortly transpire, were also the comments in the remarks section, which indicated that low-level wind shear had been reported in all quadrants. Wind shear is where the direction and or magnitude of the prevailing wind changes quite rapidly, having the potential, as we'll demonstrate later, to adversely affect aircraft performance. As a result, a number of airports worldwide, including Louis Armstrong International at New Orleans, have incorporated low-level wind shear alerting systems into the airport's infrastructure. The system on the day at New Orleans consists of a center field sensor located on the airport grounds, and 5 additional sensors strategically located at or near the final approach courses of each runway, all within a distance of 3 kilometers from the central unit. These sensors are designated west, south, east adjacent to the crash site, northeast and northwest. Each of the sensors provides live wind direction speed data to a computer, the output of which is displayed to ATC personnel. Although uniformity of spacing is desirable between the multiple sensors, in the real world the location of these instruments is often dictated by other factors. Each should be located where they will not be affected by terrain, trees, or other similar obstacles. In order to provide advance warning to pilots, they should be located so that they can detect wind shears associated with weather systems which are moving towards the airport. Therefore, in many cases, they're typically located outside of the airport boundaries. Given the specific purpose for which these sensors were installed, namely to identify adverse shear conditions approaching the airport, with each and every one of the sensors being deemed a critical component of the overall operating system. That said, what investigators uncovered was that on the day of the accident, the west sensor was unserviceable. In fact, due to an act of vandalism, the sensor hadn't actually been operational for the previous 3 years. 4 days after the accident, the sensor was repaired and returned to service, only to be vandalised yet again 1 week later by local hunters using it for target practice. The team's findings, however, in light of the direction of travel of Clipper 759, was that the unserviceability of the west sensor had no direct impact on the events of that afternoon. Where any of the peripheral units indicate an average wind reading over a 30-second period, which differs from that of the center field sensor by 15 knots or more, both an aural and visual alarm will be generated. Likewise, where a gust exceeds the average 2-minute wind value by more than 9 knots, this too will be brought to the attention of the controllers. However, good and all as the system is, it does have certain limitations. A wind blowing at a height above the physical height of the sensor will not be detected. Likewise, wind shears beyond the periphery of the sensors will also fail to be detected. The sensors do not have the ability to register updrafts or downdrafts, and importantly, if a shear boundary happens to pass a particular peripheral sensor and the center field sensor coincidentally at the very same time, no discrepancy between the two will be detected and thus no alarm generated. All in all, however, the low-level wind shear alerting system has, over time, proven its worth, and undoubtedly does give the pilot additional information upon which to make a timely judgment call as to the merit of continuing an approach or delaying a departure. With the takeoff weight of 170,000 pounds, or just over 77 metric tons, 759 would be too heavy to consider departure from either runways 19 or 01, given the changing surface conditions and that runway's shorter length. So McCullers actually found himself with no alternative other than to depart out to the east from runway 10. Mindful of the prevailing conditions, the resultant takeoff performance had resulted in a V1 decision speed and simultaneous rotation, or takeoff speed, of 138 knots, the equivalent of 159 miles per hour or just over 255 kilometers per hour, with a minimum safe climb-out speed V2 of 151 knots. At 15:59 as 759 taxied out to the departure runway, Pearce requested a wind check from the tower, which was given as 040 degrees at 8 knots, more than adequate for their intended departure from that specific runway. Although McCullers and his crew never received ATIS information Gulf, as they continued for runway 10 at 16:02, ground control advised another departing aircraft, Texas International 794, of low-level wind shear alerts in the northeast quadrants, and provided the relevant wind direction and speeds. CVR transcripts confirmed that this broadcast had also been received in the cockpit of 759, and as such McCullers and his crew were aware of the changing environment. However, that said, it should be noted that wind shear alerts in isolation would not necessarily be deemed reason enough to warrant postponement of an arrival or departure. Indeed, an experienced crew throughout their career could expect to be issued such alerts possibly hundreds of times, particularly in this part of the world during this time of the year. Rather, these alerts were intended to be a valuable contribution into what would be a more complex overall evaluation of the operational environment. Indeed, such was the interpretation to be taken from the various PanAm manuals, with the tower supervisor likewise testifying post-accidents that in his experience, seldom did a captain alter his course of action based on these alerts alone. This being the norm, nothing in the subsequent reports suggested that McCullers was anything other than go-minded, despite broadcasts of these alerts just 6 minutes prior to his own departure, although his progress was notably cautious. At 16:03, Pierce again queried the tower as to the current wind, with ground replying,
"Wind now 070 degrees at 17 knots, with a peak of 23. We've low-level wind shear in all quadrants. Appears to be a frontal system passing overhead right now, and we're right in the middle of everything."
McCullers turned to Pierce, who would be the pilot actually flying the leg to Las Vegas, and offered some words of advice.
"Let your speed build up on takeoff."
In so doing, his intention was to have his first officer maximise the aircraft's performance margin, should they actually encounter any shear after takeoff. McCullers then swivelled in his seat to face Noon at the flight engineers panel.
"Leo, you want to do a no-packs takeoff on this thing?"
In the skipper's mind, switching off the air conditioning packs temporarily during takeoff would allow for marginally more power to be extracted from the aircraft's engines, a prudent move under the circumstances, again focusing on the aircraft's performance capabilities. And so, with pre-departure checks complete, 759's crew were as prepared as they could be as they completed the taxi out and awaited their turn for departure. As the rain continued to fall, as forecast, visibility along the runway began to decrease. Indeed, between 1600 and 1620, a 20-minute window extending 10 minutes either side of the accident, reported visibility along runway 10 decreased quite quickly from values of 4 to 5 statute miles to at times as low as 1200 feet, the equivalent of just 360 metres. Likewise, during the period, the surface wind was observed to pick up, with the previous light and variable conditions at times giving way to sudden gusts of 20 knots or more. A study of aircraft movements at the time gives a good insight as to how the prevailing conditions were impacting on the operation, and indeed how quickly those conditions were changing. New Orleans is configured with a number of taxiways serving two perpendicular runways, namely the north-south orientated 0119 and the east-west orientated 1028. A smaller diagonally orientated runway 0523 joins the two, but it's too short for regular commercial traffic. Of the two, 1028 is the longer at just over 9,200 feet, and it was for this reason, fully laden, that 759 had opted for a departure from runway 10. Between 15:58 local, 11 minutes before the accident, and 16:27, 18 minutes after, 4 commercial flights and 1 general aviation aircraft departed the airport. Another carrier, having taxied to runway 10, subsequently decided not to depart. The first of these aircraft to depart 11 minutes prior to the accident was Delta Flight 1622. According to the crew, utilising their onboard weather radar, they had identified a thunder cell directly overhead the airport, which extended slightly north of runway 10, and that there were other storm cells to the south at a range of about 25 miles. Two minutes later, November 58 Romeo Delta, a Boeing 707, after landing on runway 10, reported to the tower controller that they had experienced wind shear on the approach, which had resulted in the loss of 10 knots at approximately 100 feet. 3 minutes later, at 16:01, just 8 minutes before the accident, Republic Airlines Flight 632, a DC-930 series aircraft, departed from runway 19. This crew also used their onboard weather radar equipment to scan the local area while taxiing from the gate. In their subsequent deposition, the captain stated that thunderstorms were all around the airport. In particular, he recalled one being to the east-northeast, with numerous cells likewise to the south, southwest and west, at ranges of between 5 and 20 miles from the airport. Focusing on the cell to the northeast, he stated that it was the largest by far, and that he remembered that the intensity gradient as he looked into the storm, as depicted by the weather radar, was very steep, characteristic of a mature and dangerous storm. He also testified that during their takeoff roll, they encountered heavy rain, reduced visibility and wind shear from about the midpoint of runway 19. In fact, such was the effect of the changing wind conditions that his aircraft began to drift to the right, off the runway centerline, despite his efforts to correct using left rudder. Having considered abandoning the takeoff roll altogether, he instead elected to continue for fear that during any deceleration, the deviation would continue and that he would eventually leave the paved surface. In deciding to continue, however, he was, out of necessity, forced to rotate earlier than planned in order to get the aircraft airborne while still on the runway, and in so doing had eaten into his slender stall protection margin. Sure enough, for a heart-stopping moment, as he commanded the gear to be retracted, the stall warning in the cockpit of the DC-9 briefly sounded. 632's first officer corroborated in full his captain's testimony. As the monitoring pilot, however, his perspective allowed him to make some additional observations which the captain, being busy flying the aircraft, hadn't actually noticed at the time. The first officer remembered seeing speed fluctuations between 100 and 110 knots as the aircraft accelerated down runway 19. With a V1 decision speed of 121 knots and a planned rotation speed of 140 knots, he remembered the captain hauling the aircraft into the air some 20 knots earlier than planned. Passing over the departure end of the runway, he remembered the aircraft accelerating rapidly through 160 knots. Just after getting airborne, he called the departure controller and advised him that they had encountered wind shear on the departure, without specifying magnitude of the shear or the height at which it had been encountered. Whether this was the reason or not, the departure controller failed to inform his colleagues in the tower of 632's observation, which, given the relative time proximity to the accident, may have been significant. Another 3 minutes after 632's departure and the next aircraft to go, also off runway 19, was Texas International Flight 794, another DC-9 30 series aircraft. Indicative of just how transient these conditions can be, the crew of 794, although likewise observing thunder cells to the southwest at a range of 5 to 6 miles, only encountered light rain during their takeoff roll, with no reference to turbulence or wind shear whatsoever. With Eastern 956, now approximately 4 miles from touchdown on runway 10, Clipper 759 was issued its takeoff clearance and commenced its takeoff roll. At the time, the tower controller passed the previous comments of the landed 707 to Eastern 956. However, critically, there were no current low-level wind shear alerts active at the time Clipper 759 was released. US Air Flight 404, also a DC-930, had taxied behind Clipper 759 to runway 10. While 759 was taking the runway for departure, the captain of 404 taxied to the apron and turned onto a heading of 030 degrees, facing northeast. He recalled that he did see some precipitation present, but not all that heavy. He further testified that he had told his first officer, "We'll see how PanAm does, and then we'll take a look." After 759 departed, the captain again taxied his aircraft towards runway 10, and while awaiting to take off, heard that PanAm had crashed. He subsequently shut his engines down and waited for the weather to pass, finally stating that having done so, and now facing west, he never actually got to see exactly what 759 had taken off into. At about the same time that Clipper 759 had impacted the residential area of Kenner to the east of the airport, a Cessna Citation private general aviation aircraft, registration November 31 Mike Tango, was awaiting its turn to depart from runway 19. While holding short, The pilot took advantage of the wide apron area and with ground control's approval completed a 360-degree turn for the purpose of examining the local weather surrounding the airport. This pilot subsequently stated that he had observed 2 storm cells about 2 to 3 miles east of the airport, roughly a quarter of a mile apart, and another cell approximately 7 miles southwest of the airport. Each cell, he said, was approximately 3 to 4 miles in diameter, with the walls of the respective cells showing significant severity gradients. These, he believed, were either level 4 or level 5 radar echoes. Thereafter, November 31 Mike Tango was cleared to taxi to and take off from the reciprocal end, that being runway 01, in order to avoid the worst of the weather to the south. The pilot was asked retrospectively whether he had ever considered using runway 10 for departure. He testified that he had not, primarily because of the weather out to the east. At exactly the same time, Southwest 860, a Boeing 737, had taxied a hole short of runway 01. The captain of this flight also testified that his onboard weather radar was painting a storm cell directly above his aircraft, which was 5 to 6 miles wide, extending to approximately 2 miles east of the airport. He said that the intensity gradient of the storm wall was quite pronounced to the south side of the departure end of runway 10. While in the position, he had observed both Republic 632 and Texas International 794 depart from runway 19, and thereafter he was given lineup clearance. After finally aligning his aircraft with runway 01, he noted that the cell observed earlier was still more or less in the same general position. While looking at the weather, he said he observed Clipper 759 pass left to right and over the departure end of 10 at a height which he estimated to be about 200 feet. The landing gear was retracted and the aircraft had started to make a shallow left-hand turn. He recalled at his position it was raining lightly and visibility to the east, the direction in which Clipper 759 was travelling, was about 3 miles. Southwest subsequently departed from runway 01 at 16:27 local, 18 minutes after the accident, and 9 minutes after the citation November 31 Mike Tango, who had also opted for a northerly departure from New Orleans. The last of the ground movements at the time was that of Delta 169, who was cleared at 16:09 to taxi to runway 19. Although the subsequent accident report makes no reference to any comments made by this crew in relation to the prevailing conditions at the time. According to witnesses, 759 lifted off about 7,000 feet down runway 10, climbing in a wings level attitude and reaching a height of about 100 to 150 feet above ground level. Thereafter, the 727 started to descend. The pitch attitude of the aircraft during the final part of the takeoff and climb was described as normal, or at least similar to other 727s during that phase of flight. One extremely credible witness was situated in the tower at the time, itself 126 feet high. He recalled how he saw Clipper 759 lift off near the intersection of runway 10 and the center taxiway.
Rotation, liftoff and the initial climb segment, all appeared to be normal. I observed the aircraft climb in a normal manner until it reached an altitude of about my eye level, at which time I turned away.
Another credible witness, who happened to be a professional pilot himself, was sitting in his truck just east of the departure end of runway 10. He recalled that as Clipper 759 passed just in front of him, it was no higher than 100 feet above the ground, and that it had a very slight pitch-up attitude. He stated that the attitude wasn't normal as one would expect to see on climb-out, and that it didn't change as the aircraft began a gradual descent, eventually disappearing behind a line of trees and out of his direct sight. 759 never regained this lost altitude and crashed into the residential suburb of Kenner, where 66,000 people lived in the shadow of Louisiana's largest airport. The impact, explosion and subsequent fire destroyed the 727 and tore a swathe through the neighbourhood, resulting in the destruction of 6 homes and the extensive damage of 5 more. But what exactly had gone so wrong so as to cause a state-of-the-art commercial airliner, as the Boeing 727 was in the early 1980s, to apparently just fall out of the sky? With publication of the official NTSB report into the accident dated March 1983, some 8 months after the event, the investigation team determined that the probable cause of the accident was the aircraft's encounter during liftoff and initial climb phase of flight with a microburst-induced wind shear, which imposed a downdraft and a decreasing headwind, the effects of which the pilot would have had difficulty recognising and reacting to in time for the aircraft's descent to be arrested before its impact trees. Contributing to the accident was the limited capability of current ground-based low-level wind shear detection technology to provide definitive guidance for controllers and pilots for use in avoiding low-level wind shear encounters. So what exactly is a microburst, and why had it impacted so dramatically on the flight path of Clipper 759? Microbursts are a phenomenon associated with thunderstorms and have only really been studied and fully understood since about the mid-1970s. As a thunderstorm develops, updrafts within the storm cloud pick up a lot of rain and hail, which is cooled as it descends. When the force of this updraft weakens for whatever reason, this mass of relatively cold air can no longer be supported by the environment around it. As such, the process of updraft now stalls and instead reverses, with this cooler air mass now descending within the storm cloud, establishing a significant downdraft as it does so. As the raindrops and hail descend, the tendency is for them to cool the surrounding air mass as they evaporate or melt, accelerating the cooling effect throughout the entire cloud mass. Then, all of a sudden, this developing huge mass of descending cool air collapses through the bottom of the thunderstorm on its downward trajectory to the ground below. As this column of air, which can potentially descend at rates of 4,000 to 6,000 feet per minute, hits the surface of the earth below, it is deflected outward, producing a diverging radial flow in all directions simultaneously. Of note is the fact that a downdraft of this magnitude has the potential to outperform even the climb capabilities of the most modern commercial airliners. By nature, microbursts are short-lived, usually lasting no more than 5 to 15 minutes, and are relatively compact, usually affecting an area of between 1 to 3 kilometres in diameter. Study would suggest that peak winds will most likely be observed between 1.6 and 1.8 kilometres from the core, with wind speeds becoming insignificant again as the diverging flow reaches a distance of 4 kilometres or so. Where the actual outflow diameter is in excess of this figure, in reality the effect on a transiting aircraft are significantly less. An aircraft transversing the burst at low height above the ground will encounter increasing headwinds as it enters the microburst, remnants of the downdraft near the centre, then increasing tailwinds as it departs the area. This shear from headwind to tailwind can often be of a magnitude of up to 50 knots, meaning that what initially is experienced as a 25-knot headwind may rapidly turn into a 25-knot tailwind. Wet microbursts, typically of more humid areas, are generally accompanied by a visible rain shaft. However, in arid regions, the rain commonly associated with microbursts often evaporates before the downdraft reaches the ground. The resulting dry microbursts produce no visible clues to their presence. Thus, it's quite possible that a dry microburst may go undetected by the aircraft's onboard radar, which operates on the principle of moisture particles reflecting the radar signal. Furthermore, data would seem to suggest no established relationship between storm intensity and microburst generation, meaning that there is no room for complacency around even the smallest of cells. In order to understand exactly how microbursts aerodynamically affect aircraft transiting them, it's worth having a look again at the general lift equation, which I've introduced in a number of earlier video presentations. The lift produced by the aircraft's wing is generally expressed by the equation a half rho v squared SCL, where rho relates to the density of the air, v squared the relative speed of the airflow over the wing's surface, s the area of the wing itself, and CL relating to the wing's aerodynamic characteristics and its orientation to the relative airflow, or in other words, its angle of attack. Typically, as the aircraft approaches the microburst, the dispersal effect of the airflow striking the ground will result in it experiencing an increased headwind component. Studies would suggest that the peak horizontal wind flow will usually be found about 75 feet or so above ground level. As the aircraft experiences this increased headwind, look how it impacts on the general lift equation. Although the downward movement of the flow will slightly reduce the wing's angle of attack, and thus the lift it is producing, this will be more than compensated for by the resultant increase in the value of v squared, as the aircraft's indicated airspeed increases, with the net result being that the overall lift produced by the wing is increased, and thus the aircraft will tend to rise above the nominal climb gradient, which is indicated here by the orange line. As the aircraft continues forward, this increasing headwind will be replaced by a residual downdraft as the aircraft passes directly under the storm cell. As the relative direction of the flow is now almost vertically downward, the wing's angle of attack will be reduced still further, and no longer enjoying the performance-enhancing benefit of an increasing headwind, the magnitude of v squared will also be reduced. With the density of the environment outside remaining relatively constant, likewise the shape of the wing, insofar as configuration will not be changed. These combined reductions in the values of v squared and CL will negatively impact on the total lift being produced by the wing, and the aircraft will descend as a result. As the aircraft moves through the downdraft, the relative wind now moves to being an increasing tailwind. The effect here is that indicated airspeed will decrease, thus the value of v squared will correspondingly decrease, and without significant pilot intervention, and even then recovery not being guaranteed, the already established descent will only continue, with ground contact being a realistic proposition. In short, passage through either a downdraft, reducing headwind, or increasing tailwind can all be singularly hazardous. However, when combined, these conditions can produce an even more critical situation. The severity of the effects produced by an encounter of this type will depend on the magnitude of the changes in wind speed and the abruptness with which these changes occur. The higher the speed changes and the shorter the time interval involved, the greater the effect on the aircraft's flight path and the more challenging any potential recovery. Which in the case of Clipper 759 simply didn't happen. Specifically with regard to the impact of 759, as the 727 proceeded out towards the departure runway, the cockpit voice recorder confirmed conclusively that McCullers had selected his onboard weather radar on and was proactively examining the surrounding environment as the rain began to fall heavily. Simultaneously, conscious of the high gross weight of the jet, he and Pierce reviewed the rejected takeoff and fuel dumping procedures should any emergency call for their implementation. At 16:07 and 44 seconds, 759 was cleared into position on the active runway. As they did so, most probably in light of observed weather ahead out to the east, Pierce asked his captain,
"Right or left turn after we get out of here?"
To which McCullers responded,
"I'd suggest a slight turn to the left."
The readout from the flight data recorder confirmed that indicated airspeed began increasing at 16:07 and 57 seconds, as takeoff power was applied to the three Pratt & Whitney JT8D engines, and 759 began its takeoff roll. Per standard procedure, as takeoff clearance was issued, the tower controller called the surface wind as 070 degrees 17 knots, meaning with the commencement of the takeoff roll, 759 was experiencing a headwind component of about 14 knots, or at least that would have been the case had the aircraft been physically at the very point at which the wind details were being recorded, that being the centre field sensor. However, exhaustive post-accident modelling told a slightly different real story. Investigators believe that as 759 began its takeoff roll, the actual wind at the threshold of runway 10, which was some distance away from the centre field sensor, was actually registering as a moderate tailwind of about 8 knots, which admittedly shifted quickly to an 8-knot headwind some 2,600 feet into the takeoff roll, or 27.5 seconds after brake release, with this diminishing to a 4-knot headwind at rotation, which occurred some 4,560 feet into the runway and some 37 seconds after the aircraft had started to roll. The reason why the headwind component had started to decay even as 759 rotated, when compared to the previous model presented, can be explained when we look at the exact location of the microburst itself. In their final report, the NTSB were reasonably confident that Clipper 759 had actually flown through the centre of a convectively generated downdraft very shortly after liftoff, with analysis of the flight data recorder strongly supporting the conclusion that the downdraft was a weak to moderate downburst emanating from a level 3 storm cell, most probably centred about 2,000 feet east of the centre field sensor and some 700 feet north of the runway centreline, essentially adjacent the departure end of runway 10. Negatively impacted by the environmental conditions as Clipper 759 climbed into the turbulent skies above, it achieved a maximum height of only 163 feet above ground level before starting a downward trajectory, which an alarmed McCullers highlighted to his first officer.
Come on back, Don. You're sinking.
During this time, what had been a slight headwind at rotation had now become a slight tailwind at 35 feet, increasing to a maximum as the aircraft left the airport grounds, before decreasing slightly again just prior to impact. The vertical downdraft, although slight as the aircraft climbed through 35 feet, increased to its maximum value as the aircraft reached 100 feet above the ground, but it too subsequently decreased as the 727 transited the microburst and continued toward the point of impact. Despite everything, this downward trajectory was in fact arrested by the crew at a height of 51 feet above ground level, but even as the aircraft began to transition back into a moderate climb of 360 feet per minute, this precious 51 feet would not be sufficient to save the jet and all those on board. Struggling to gain altitude, 759 made contact with a line of trees just to the east of Williams Boulevard, with a body attitude of 12 degrees nose up. From commencement of the takeoff roll to impact with these trees had taken a mere 64 seconds and just over 11,500 feet. At exactly 16:09 and 3 seconds, about 2 seconds after Clipper 759 struck the trees, there was a low-level wind shear alert involving the east sensor in the general geographic location of the accident site, with the ground controller reporting the centre field wind as 08015 knots compared to the east sensor value of 310 degrees at 6. This easterly wind at 15 knots would have resulted in the 727 experiencing a 14-knot headwind component on the takeoff roll, whereas a northwesterly wind of 5 knots, as recorded by the east sensor, would have resulted in a tailwind component of 5 knots or thereabouts as the aircraft approached the point of impact. At first glance, what can be concluded from these figures is that given the tree line on Williams Boulevard is approximately 300 feet beyond the east sensor, the aircraft most probably experienced a 19-knot decreasing headwind shear within a distance of approximately 5,850 feet. Although the east sensor had been placed in accordance with established criteria, there were nonetheless trees to the north, east and south, since this northwesterly wind from a direction of 310 degrees would have had to flow over the tree line before impinging upon the sensor. Its corresponding value of 6 knots could have been a lot lower than the actual speed. In fact, if we were to rely solely on eyewitness reports, just before the time of the accident, those in the immediate area of the crash reported that the winds were blowing from west to east, causing whole trees to move. This description, according to the Federal Meteorological Handbook of whole trees in motion, actually corresponds to a wind speed of 28 to 33 knots. Therefore, assuming the direction to be correct, a wind blowing from 310 degrees with a magnitude of 30 knots and not 6 as reported could potentially result in a much more significant shear of closer to 40 knots. Having hit the tree line adjacent Williams Boulevard, 2,376 feet beyond the departure end of the runway, Clipper 759 continued on an easterly track for another 2,234 feet, hitting more trees and houses as it did so, before finally crashing into the residential area of Kenner, some 4,610 feet from the end of the runway. The 727 had crashed a couple of doors down from the intersection of Fairway Street and 17th Street, destroying a house at 1624 Fairway. Breaking apart as it went, the plane cartwheeled forward and slid for another 2.5 city blocks, tearing diagonally across Hudson Street, 17th Street and Taylor Street. A fireball curled into the sky over Kenner as the jet fuel ignited, setting the mangled wreckage ablaze. In mere seconds, the crash turned a quiet residential neighbourhood into a scene of total devastation. Some residents of Kenner never knew what hit them. At the first house to be struck, 4 members of the Giancorte family were all killed, including 3 young boys. Farther along, the plane tore through the Schultz household, killing 11-year-old Jennifer Schultz, while her mother Barbara, 7-year-old sister Rachel, and Rachel's friend Lisa Bay suffered severe burns while they tried to escape through a window. Lisa, 6, subsequently died in hospital. The plane also demolished the home of the Trahan family, where Melanie Trahan was at home with her daughters, Bridget, 4, and Melissa, 16 months. Melanie and Bridget were both killed. A few got lucky. 3 members of the Weems family, whose house was completely levelled, had just minutes earlier left to buy bread. The first rescuers on the scene were faced with total pandemonium. 6 houses had been totally destroyed and 5 others were severely damaged, and there was hardly anything left of the 727 save for the tail. The tangled debris of the plane had been mixed with the shattered wood and cinder blocks from the houses, and the entire mess set ablaze, throwing up a cloud of black smoke that could be seen for miles. Shocked residents of Kenner, some of them suffering from severe burns, wandered at the periphery of the devastation. Many couldn't be sure whether their homes were still standing or whether their loved ones were still alive. Ambulances rushed several people to nearby hospitals, while firefighters struggled to bring the blaze under control and look for survivors. For several hours the search proved fruitless. All they could find were bodies, from both the plane and from Kenner. There were bodies lying in the streets, crushed under the rubble of homes, even floating in a swimming pool. Of the 138 passengers and 7 crew on board Flight 759, none had survived. On top of that, the death toll on the ground was beginning to rise. Then, after several hours, a police officer spotted movement in the wreckage. To the complete disbelief of everyone on the scene, he found 16-month-old Melissa Turan alive in the rubble of her house, pinned underneath the mattress from her crib, which had flipped over on top of her and sheltered her from the flames. The entire recovery operation came to a halt as first responders cried tears of joy at the discovery of just a single survivor amid so much carnage. All told, 8 residents of Kenner lost their lives that day, 6 of them children under the age of 12. With the addition of the 145 people on the aircraft, this brought the death toll to 153, making PanAm Flight 759 the second deadliest crash on US soil at the time. Of note, the figure is sometimes quoted as 154, due to the inclusion of an unborn baby carried by a passenger on the aircraft who was 7.5 months pregnant. There is tangible evidence which appears to substantiate the airplane's theoretical capability to negotiate the derived environmental conditions. The swathe through the two groups of trees at the impact site indicated that at impact Clipper 759 was in level flight or even in a slight climb. The evidence also showed that during the last 5 to 6 seconds before impact, Clipper 759's airspeed had actually increased by 18 knots. Had the crew been able to recognise and react to the changing flight path immediately, this increase in kinetic energy may have been used to decrease the rate of descent and perhaps level the aircraft more quickly. The swathe through the two groups of trees also indicated that the pilot may have recognised the wind shear but too late to avoid the trees themselves. However, the fact that the wind shear was encountered immediately after takeoff and during the initial climb made it more difficult for the pilot to detect the wind shear. Normally during the passage through a downburst or microburst, the airplane will first encounter an increasing headwind, a downdraft, and then a loss of headwind or a sudden tailwind. An airplane which approaches a microburst or downdraft, either during cruise flight or during an approach to landing, is generally in stable flight conditions when the phenomena is encountered. That is, the airplane's flight attitude and airspeed are stabilised. Under these flight conditions, the changes in airspeed, pitch attitude and performance produced by the airplane's passage through the divergent wind flow would be more apparent to the pilot than they would be immediately after takeoff and during initial climb. During takeoff, the airplane is accelerating to reach the minimum level of performance to initiate flight. The pilot's actions are predicated upon his reaching target airspeed values. In such a scenario, he's not in a position to recognise that the rate of airspeed increase is the result of an increasing headwind as well as the airplane's inertial acceleration. He responds to the airspeed to achieve liftoff and achieve his normal initial flight pitch attitude. Thus, the airplane is not likely to attain a performance margin during takeoff into a downburst or microburst to cushion the effects of downdraft and headwind loss. The slower the entry airspeed, the longer the exposure to the downdraft, and the more significant the angle of attack change resulting from the combined downdraft and headwind loss. The magnified aerodynamic performance penalty combined with the absence of altitude available for recovery present an extremely severe hazard. If the airplane is theoretically capable of maintaining level flight during the microburst penetration, the avoidance of ground impact is contingent upon rapid recognition of the situation and reaction by the crew. It would necessitate a rapid pitch change to a perhaps unaccustomed attitude to immediately decrease the airplane's descent flight path angle. In referring back to the general lift equation once more, as the combined decreasing headwind and downdraft act to negatively impact on the total lift being produced by the wing, the only tools at the pilot's disposal to reverse, or at least halt this trend, is to apply as much engine power as is available in order to attempt to increase the depleting value of V squared, while simultaneously rotating the nose of the aircraft upward, thereby increasing the angle of attack and the resultant value of CL. How much of an increase is necessary? Well, in short, as much as it takes, meaning that the pilot may well be forced to adjust the body attitude to a value just short of the critical angle of attack, the point beyond which aerodynamic stall will occur and all lift will be lost. It's also important to note that flying at such an extreme angle of attack, although completely necessary and wholly warranted under the circumstances, is not a manoeuvre that most pilots are likely to instinctively execute correctly, at least not without a considerable amount of practice in the simulator. As well as the necessary flight training which needs to be provided, the success or otherwise of a pilot's execution of the recovery procedure is also predicated on the clues available to him at the time. An ability to recognise the aircraft's decaying flight profile is of paramount importance, but this is sometimes easier said than done. Let me explain. During the takeoff roll until liftoff, the pilot flying the airplane uses visual reference to maintain directional control, although he will periodically monitor his airspeed indicator and flight director for rotation to the correct takeoff climb attitude. He would probably transition to instrument flight as he established climb and certainly as he enters heavy precipitation. Indeed, such was the case with Clipper 759. With visual cues obscured by the heavy precipitation encountered on the takeoff roll, the pilot would have been totally reliant on his instrument presentation as a cue to the airplane's attitude, airspeed, and flight path. Although an airplane may theoretically have the performance capability to penetrate a downburst or microburst without ground contact, success is contingent upon the ability of the pilot to recognize and react immediately to the hazard. From liftoff, the reaction of the pilot would have to include his perception of the dynamic instrument presentations, evaluation of these readings, and finally control column force application. The added response time for the airplane to react to the control column movement is another factor that would further modify the airplane's theoretical performance capability. Analysis showed that the airplane climbed for about 11 seconds, after which the pitch attitude decreased from 13 degrees nose up to 5, and a descending flight path thus developed. It also showed that the pilot did react to the descent, and a nose-up pitching moment was developed within 6 seconds of the descent. However, the descent was not arrested until tree impact was inevitable. A University of Southern California report at the time indicated that a pilot already viewing an essential flight instrument would probably require a minimum of 4.25 seconds to respond, which includes recognition of the instrument deviation, perceiving its significance, and reacting with a force applied to the control column. The board believed that factors such as heavy precipitation, turbulence, the need to apply an abnormal force to the control column, and the need to achieve an unfamiliar pitch maneuver would adversely affect the pilot's recognition and responses. On the other hand, the onset of a ground proximity warning alert could prompt a pilot to act more positively, although evidence in this particular case indicated that the pilot probably had reacted and was applying corrective action when the GPWS alarmed. The performance analysis showed that the airplane theoretically could have maintained a height of 95 feet above ground level. The physical evidence at the accident site showed that the pilot had been able to arrest the descent rate and place the airplane in a slight climb at or before the initial tree strike at about 50 feet. Given the adverse factors which could have delayed the pilot's reactions, and given the fact that the altitude difference between the theoretical capability of the aircraft to maintain level flight and the actual performance of the airplane was only about 45 feet, the board concluded that the pilot's actions to correct the airplane's nose-down pitching moment and descending flight path at least equaled the response which could have been expected under the prevailing conditions. In other words, taking all of the variables into consideration, Pearce, in handling the aircraft, had reacted to the situation in as timely a manner as he possibly could have. While the safety board believed strongly that the most positive prevention of this type of accidents is avoidance of critical microburst encounters, they were also convinced other actions must be taken so as to empower flight crew who experience the phenomenon without warning effect a successful recovery. They believed that the current analog instrumentation fitted to transport aircraft of the time had to be improved, and that simulator training must be broadened to increase the flight crew's knowledge of the airplane's flight characteristics during varied wind shear encounters, so that they can recognize the onset of the wind shear more quickly and also recognize the need to take rapid corrective action in order to prevent a critical loss of altitude. Both of these actions could effectively improve pilot response time and may mean the difference between a catastrophic accident and successful microburst penetration. Flight director logic of the time provided the pilot pitch command guidance to either a fixed takeoff attitude, as is the case with most older jet transport airplanes, such as the 727 involved in this accident, or an optimum climb airspeed, as is the case with the newer wide-body airplanes. In either system, the pitch command guidance was not programmed to account for the environmental wind conditions experienced in a downburst or microburst. These flight directors would in fact provide takeoff and initial climb path commands which, if followed, were likely to produce a descending flight path as the airplane experienced downdraft and loss of headwind. The board believed that the FAA and industry should expedite the development and installation of a flight director system which would include enhanced pitch guidance logic which responds to inertial speed, airspeed changes, and ground proximity. Although the safety board noted that most air carriers, including PanAm, provide pilots with wind shear penetration demonstrations during the recurrent simulator training, there does not appear to be a consistent syllabus which encompasses microburst encounters during all critical phases of flight. Because of the difference in airplane configuration, performance margins, and flight director logic, the board believed that flight crews should be exposed to simulated microburst encounters during takeoff as well as approach phases of flight. Having analysed Pearce's reaction to the downburst, the next significant issue to resolve was whether McCullers was correct in even taking off in the first instance. The safety board examined the guidelines concerning thunderstorm and wind shear avoidance provided in the PanAm manuals, the weather information provided by the company, the ATC advisories issued before takeoff, and the use of the aircraft's weather radar system. The description of thunderstorms, wind shear, and the meteorological phenomena associated with them were adequately explained in the PanAm company manuals, and represented an accurate portrayal of the low-level wind shear as known on the date of the accident. The manuals emphasise that low-level wind shear are associated with thunderstorms and that they can be in front of, to one side of, and even behind the storm cell. The PanAm Flight Ops Manual stated that in the event of significant thunderstorm activity within 15 miles of the airport, the captain should consider conducting the departure or arrival from a different direction or delaying the takeoff or landing. Use all available information for this judgment, including pilot reports, ground radar, aircraft radar, tower reported winds, and visual observations. Although in truth, because of Clipper 759's takeoff gross weight, runway 10 was the only runway available to facilitate a departure, and so McCullers really had no other options. The same manual also contained a short description of the low-level wind shear alerting system, its limitations, and the type of information the flight crew could expect to receive from the controllers at airport fitted with the system. It categorically said that information thus provided is strictly informational and no action is required unless deemed appropriate by the pilot. Thereafter, it's the captain's responsibility to evaluate and decide the severity of the weather with which he must contend, and based on this decision, to choose an appropriate course of action. Thus, the board sought to examine the information provided to McCullers and to ascertain its adequacy relevant to his decision to take off. The flight folder provided to the captain of Clipper 759 at Miami contained the 740 area forecast, which was still valid at the time Clipper 759 departed New Orleans. The area forecast had predicted thunderstorm activity near the New Orleans International Airport and also stated that the thunderstorms imply possible low-level wind shear. Thus, the captain knew that thunderstorms with associated low-level wind shear activity might affect his arrival and departure at New Orleans International. At 15:10, while Clipper 759 was at the gate, the Houston meteorologist called New Orleans Tower on the FAA interphone and advised the controllers of potential level 4 and 5 thunderstorms to the southwest moving towards the airport, but failed to provide any relative distance information. As a result, the senior controller subsequently testified that the tower's radar display was set at the 20-mile range and that the storms described by the meteorologist were nowhere to be seen. It is a fact that information concerning these storms was never relayed to any traffic at or near the airport, nor was there any requirement to do so. The meteorologist relayed this information to the New Orleans Tower because, based on their intensity and direction of movement, he considered them to be significant. The evidence showed that the storms did move towards the airport, and at about 1600, they were about 5 to 10 miles south-southeast of the airport itself. The board recognised that the storms reported by the meteorologist at 15:10 did not, based on current criteria, require that a SIGMET or a report of significant meteorological observation be issued. However, the board also believed that any convective weather advisory provided by meteorologists to a terminal facility should be relayed by that facility to the pilots by inserting it into an ATIS message or as part of an opening communication between an arriving or departing airplane and the appropriate controller. The evidence showed that the storms south of the airport did not affect Clipper 759's takeoff. The evidence also showed that the captain and the first officer saw the storm south of the airport on the airplane's weather radar. The cockpit voice recorder showed that both pilots had agreed that they would turn left or to the north after takeoff, since a right turn to the south would have been the shortest way to proceed on course to their destination. The left turn suggests strongly that the decision to do so was based on weather radar information, which depicted precipitation echoes to the south departure track. Thus, the only information concerning the storms which the captain did not have was the fact that at 15:10 the precipitation echoes of these storms was suggested that they could be of a category 4 or 5 intensity. Since the captain was aware of the storms to the south of his projected departure track, the safety board concluded that, in this instance, the failure to require the terminal facility to relay information provided by the meteorologist to the pilot was in fact not a causal factor in the accident. When Clipper 759 departed the gate at 15:55, ATIS Foxtrot was valid and contained the 13:55 surface observation. When the 14:55 surface weather observation was received, ATIS Foxtrot, in accordance with ATC procedures, should have been revised, but it wasn't. And the ATC controller testified that the failure to do so was a genuine oversight on his part. The significant difference between the 13:55 and the 14:55 observations was the remark cumulus build-up overhead east and south. The 14:55 observation had been faxed to the PanAm flight operations area and was available to Clipper 759's flight crew. Examination of the aircraft's takeoff performance calculation completed by the crew showed that the 14:55 weather observation data was used in the computation. Therefore, the safety board concluded that the pilots had read the 14:55 observation. In addition, conversation between the captain and a member of the ground crew personnel also indicated that the captain was well aware of the convective weather activity around the airport. He had seen it on his arrival at New Orleans, and based on its observed movement, he had expected it to move towards an impact upon the airport. The safety board concluded that since the captain had read and was aware of the contents of the 14:55 surface weather observation, the fact that an ATIS message reflecting the 14:55 observation was not issued was not a causal factor in the accident. At 15:55, another surface observation was received in the tower and in the PanAm flight operations area. In addition to the recorded weather data, the observation noted that there were heavy rain showers and cumulonimbus overhead. At 16:03, a special weather observation was issued, which, except for decreased visibility, was essentially the same as the 15:55 observation. At 16:04 and 45 seconds, ATIS Gulf was issued. Gulf contained the 16:03 special observation and in addition contained the advisory remark, low-level wind shear alerts all quadrants. Although good practice, there was no requirement for ATC to broadcast on all frequencies that a new ATIS had actually been issued. Clipper 759's flight crew left the company's ops area before the 15:55 and 16:03 weather observations were received. Therefore, McCullers didn't receive the information set forth in the two weather observations, nor ATIS Gulf. However, the evidence showed that the captain was to receive virtually all of this data from other sources. It was raining while Clipper 759 was taxiing from the gate to runway 10. After reaching the west end of runway 10 and while turning on the runway and toward the takeoff heading, the heavier rain at midfield and to the east would have been visually apparent to the captain. Given the weather data he already had and the type of precipitation he was seeing, the board concluded that it would have been apparent to McCullers that the rain was emanating from cumulonimbus cloud over the airport. Significantly, he would have also observed that there was neither lightning nor thunder present at that time. At 16:03 and 37 seconds, ATC advised the captain that there were low-level wind shear alerts in all quadrants, and there was a frontal passing overhead right now and we're right in the middle of everything. This advisory was incomplete since it didn't include the wind direction and velocity at the peripheral sensors. However, the omission was not a causal factor in the accident. Despite the omitted data, the advisory gave the captain the pertinent weather data which was included in ATIS Gulf. He now knew of the low-level wind shear in all quadrants. He also knew from the data in his flight folder that there was no frontal activity near the airport. Therefore, he knew that whatever was producing the showers and the wind shear was directly overhead. since showers and wind shear are familiar byproducts of cumulonimbus cloud formations. Had the captain by chance not seen the cumulonimbus clouds, the advisory should have alerted the captain that such clouds were directly over the field. Shortly after receiving the advisory, McCullers advised his first officer to let his airspeed build up on takeoff, which was consistent with his having heard and understood the advisory's content. The wind sensor at the west end of runway 10 was inoperative. However, in this instance, the inoperative west sensor played no part in the accident sequence, although the winds derived in the performance analysis did indicate that there may have been a slight tailwind component during the initial segment of the takeoff roll, which switched rapidly to an increasing headwind. At liftoff, the headwind component was about 16 knots and was consistent with the winds noted at the centerfield sensor at this time. Between 1600 and 1607, ATC transmitted 9 wind shear advisories. An additional advisory was broadcast at 1609 and 3 seconds, just 2 seconds after Clipper 759 hit the trees. The senior controller testified that wind shear alert advisories were issued whenever a low-level wind shear alert was in progress and the information was operationally relevant to an aircraft. The weight of evidence confirmed this statement, and therefore, since Clipper 759 did not receive a wind shear alert advisory before takeoff, the safety board concluded that an operationally relevant wind shear alert was not in progress when Clipper 759 began its takeoff roll. McCullers had an operative weather radar which he could use to examine the weather along runway 10 and to the east of the airport. Based on the conversation on the cockpit voice recorder relating to a left turn after takeoff, and on the fact that the company procedure required that the weather radar system be used to check the departure area when possible thunderstorm activity is nearby, the board concluded that McCullers did check the departure course with his weather radar. The echoes seen on the weather radar systems of the other departing aircraft showed that there were level 3 echoes over the eastern part of the airport and just east of the airport grounds themselves. All these airplanes were at the eastern edge of the airport. Clipper 759, however, was about 1.5 miles to the west of where these aircraft were located when these level 3 echoes were observed, and its weather radar antenna was looking at the area through rain. A properly functioning weather radar would have indicated an area of precipitation over and to the east of runway 10. As stated earlier, the intensity of the weather echoes off the end of 10 would have displayed a significant severity gradient on Clipper 759's weather radar if it had been operating properly. However, attenuation due to intervening rain along the axis of the radar beam could result in this gradient not being displayed, and at the time Clipper 759 had lined up for takeoff, rain was falling near the departure end of the runway at a measured rate of about 0.5 inch per hour. Therefore, attenuation of the radar pulse could well have occurred. At the same time Clipper 759 began its takeoff roll, US Air 404 was scanning the weather east of the airport and was positioned at the takeoff end of runway 10. Its captain subsequently testified that he did see precipitation, or at least an outline of rain, but he didn't see a significant gradient. Based on this evidence, the safety board concluded that the weather radar echoes over and to the east of the airport did not display a significant gradient on 759's weather radar either. The only information available concerning the intensity and location of the weather echo cells within 15 nautical miles of the New Orleans airport was the radar echoes shown on the aircraft radar systems described earlier. These crew who observed level 3 echoes on their radars did not relay this to ATC, nor were they required to do so. Clipper 759's radar most probably showed level 1 to level 2 rain outlines. Moreover, and of significant importance, lightning and thunder were not occurring, nor had these phenomena been reported on any weather observation. Based on the total data available to the captain concerning convective weather activity, it appeared that all that was occurring at the time was rain showers, with company directives not prohibiting the captain from taking off in these circumstances. At the time the decision to take off was made, the last wind shear information was over 4 minutes old. Based on the evidence, wind shear relevant to this takeoff direction was simply not occurring. Company directives did not furnish flight crew with any quantitative restrictions as to time intervals or severity for guidance in making the takeoff decision. And in addition, PanAm's Flight Operations Manual stated that low-level wind shear reports were informational only and no action is required unless deemed appropriate by the pilot. The weight of evidence subsequently showed that the winds which affected Clipper 759 were produced by a microburst, which had occurred on the airport. Importantly, data has shown that the microburst and downburst occurrences cannot be related to storm intensity. Therefore, neither the precise moment one will occur nor the numerical probability of such an occurrence can be forecast. The wind shear which affected Clipper 759 was not detected until after it began its takeoff roll. Given the technology available in the early 80s, the safety board stated that if meteorologists and current technology cannot predict the location, the frequency of occurrence and severity of this type of wind shear, pilots cannot be expected to ordinarily or routinely predict where or when one will occur or estimate its severity. The safety board believed that the wind shear information available to the industry at the time did not provide sufficient guidance concerning wind shear avoidance. In particular, the data did not contain quantitative wind speed values which could be applied by pilots as a standard for refusing or delaying either a takeoff or an approach in landing. Consequently, the guidance contained in the PanAm Flight Ops Manual, although generally considered the state-of-the-art information, did not contain any quantitative wind speed values which would indicate that the wind shear was of a magnitude that could approach or might exceed the capability of the aircraft or pilot to fly through the phenomenon safely. Thus, the guidance in this area, unlike that concerning recommended minimum separation distances from thunderstorms, contained no quantitative wind speed parameters and no recommended courses of action for the pilot to follow should these parameters be approached or exceeded. Furthermore, it should be noted that wind speeds retrieved from the low-level wind shear alerting system may be lower than those existing at 75 to 200 feet above the ground. Therefore, the sensor wind speeds reading should be considered a conservative value for the purpose of estimating the magnitude of wind shear. However, in evaluating the decision to take off, it's necessary to stress that the procedures noted above were not contained in any of PanAm's manuals. According to the PanAm Flight Ops Manual, the values derived from the low-level wind shear system were to be used for informational purposes only. The board thus believed that the wind shear avoidance procedures based on low-level wind shear alerting information are essentially similar throughout the industry. Controller statements also show that pilots rarely delay takeoff based solely on the wind shear alerting system advisories themselves. Evidence also suggested that flight simulator wind shear training of the time may have instilled an unwarranted sense of security to flight crews rather than stressing wind shear avoidance. The exercises seem to indicate to flight crews that the wind shears may be flown through successfully by increasing the airspeed by 10 to 20 knots and then trading off the airspeed for altitude if necessary as the shear is penetrated. During the time Clipper 759 taxied from the gate towards runway 10, several wind shear advisories were received on its radio. Except for one advisory, none were directed to Clipper 759 itself. However, the pilots were responsible for monitoring the radio for any information that would affect the conduct of the flight. Considering the weather conditions which existed at the time, the safety board believed that Clipper 759's pilots heard and were aware of the wind shear advisories received on their radio and had evaluated this data before beginning their takeoff roll. Although none of these advisories involved the east sensor, the magnitude of the shears reflected in the advisories were about 10 to 15 knots. Therefore, the captain in his briefing directed the first officer to let your speed build up on takeoff, allowing an airspeed increase above V2 plus 10, in an effort to provide an airspeed margin to counteract the effects of a wind shear in the event that one was encountered along the takeoff path. As a further precaution, he also briefed the flight engineer to turn off the air conditioning packs before takeoff, thereby increasing the thrust settings on engines number 1 and 3. The PanAm Flight Operations Manual noted that wind shear and gust fronts can be generally experienced within 5 to 10 miles of a thunderstorm. It also stated that when significant thunderstorm activity is within 15 miles of the airport, the captain should take appropriate measures to avoid the storm. However, the determination of the severity of the thunderstorm and the measures to be used to avoid the thunderstorm and its associated hazards is vested in the captain, and that decision would be based on his training, experience and judgment. It's not possible to precisely determine how often McCullers and Pearce had encountered weather conditions similar to those which existed at takeoff on the accident date. However, the captain and first officer were Miami-based and had flown National Airlines and PanAm's southern routes since 1965 and 76 respectively. From climatology data, thunderstorm occurrences during the 3 summer months in various cities served by the 2 airlines in Alabama, Florida and Louisiana average about 45 days. Considering this, the board believed that the pilots were familiar with and had experience in dealing with the convective type weather occurring that afternoon, and had successfully flown in such weather and evaluated its severity using their aircraft weather radar systems. The effect of rainfall on this system is well known and had been presented to the flight crew during their initial training in its use, in operational bulletins and in cautionary notes in the PanAm Flight Ops Manual. Given the importance of this system in avoiding thunderstorms and the crew's experience of flying in areas in which convective weather activity is predominant during the summer months, the safety board concluded that both pilots were competent in the use of their radar system, were familiar with its limitations, and would have considered the effects of these limitations in their evaluation of any convective return they observed on their radar scopes. The safety board thus concluded that due to the limitations of the onboard equipment, it was possible that the radar echoes east of the field would not have depicted a severe gradient on 759's radar. From witness testimony, the captain's judgment and his ability to make timely and proper command decisions were rated as excellent. His past record demonstrated that he had performed successfully under emergency conditions and in weather conditions similar to those which existed at New Orleans on July 9th. His advice to his first officer to let your speed build up on takeoff showed that based on the wind shear information known to him at the time, he was taking precautions to cope with a possible wind shear encounter. The direction to turn left after liftoff also showed that he had assessed the weather along his projected takeoff flight path. His decision to take off indicated that based on the portrayal shown on his radar, there were no thunderstorms directly over the takeoff runway, and that the left turn after takeoff would place his aircraft on a flight path that would clear the radar echoes to the south and southeast of the airport, in accordance with the parameters established in the PanAm Flight Ops Manual. Given the captain's reputation for exercising superior judgment in the exercise of his command responsibilities, and given his performance record over the past 10 years as an airline captain, the safety board believed that it would be illogical to assume that he would decide to take off into thunderstorms which he had either observed visually or into severe radar echoes which he had seen on his aircraft's weather radar. Based on all of the factors cited above, the safety board thus concluded that McCullers' decision to take off was reasonable. It was almost 7 years previous that the first real high-profile microburst accident woke the industry up to the existence of this deadly environmental phenomenon. Eastern Flight 66, coincidentally another Boeing 727, had crashed on approach to New York's John F. Kennedy International in the latter part of June 1975 with the loss of 113 lives. This accident, also covered here in the channel, laid the foundation stone for research into the concept of adverse thunderstorm activity, and in particular, the whole issue of microburst existence and their potential influence on the aerodynamic profile of both departing and arriving traffic. At the time, the NTSB had made a number of significant recommendations, notably in relation to further research on the subject matter and the critical need to develop effective advanced warning systems, both on the ground and from the pilot's perspective, actually in the cockpit. And it was in direct response to these recommendations that the FAA had installed the very first low-level wind shear alerting system less than 12 months later. However, despite acknowledging advancements in the area, the loss of PanAm 759 some 8 years later highlighted the fact that much work still needed to be done. With publication of the final report into 759, the NTSB again made a number of significant recommendations. Recognising the various limitations of the low-level wind shear alerting system, they not only suggested that a renewed effort be made to address these shortcomings, but also went further in suggesting that research and development into alternative, more technologically advanced systems such as Doppler radar be pursued with vigour. From the pilot's perspective, again, there was renewed focus on educational and training content. Recommendations were made to enhance the simulator models being used to make them more representative of what pilots could expect on the line. And from a technical perspective, they were to recommend that industry should strive for advancements in flight director technology. Technology which would provide pilots with real-time proactive guidance in flight path management as their aircrafts encountered and transitioned such shears. And so, as with many similar accidents, paradoxically, from all of this human suffering eventually came some collective good, a not so small contribution to an aviation safety environment we today so often take for granted. This was the complete story of Pan American Flight 759, lost on the afternoon of July 9th, 1982.